Welcome back to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to go over a line in the Caro-Kann Botvinnik-Carls defense. This is where we play a quick c5 in the advanced variation, and we're going to look at 4 bishop to b5 check. So this was asked by ChessGoals member Christopher, and he wanted to see this line because he said it fundamentally changes the structure, and it's also not covered in a lot of Caro-Kann opening courses. We actually don't cover this move in our course. I think it's important that I add it here. And many other courses fail to mention this move, even though it is somewhat popular at the club level. It's a tempting check. You see bishop b5 check. Some players may want to force a trade in the minor pieces, so that bishop is about to trade for bishop or knight if it wants to. And it's also just a decent move according to Stockfish. White still is holding maybe like a zero point 0.1 edge or it's close to equal. So it's not a terrible move throwing in this check bishop to b5. So my recommendation is going to be to block with the bishop. The reason I like this is because if we block with the knight, knight d7, there's this annoying move pawn to e6. And because our knight is pinned, this bishop cannot capture back. We actually have to take back with the pawn. And if white plays d takes c5, we have this really ugly pawn structure, and it's not a fun position to play, trying to figure out how do we move the knight, how do we move the bishop, get this other knight out. We got the weak diagonal, the weak pawn on e6. I want to avoid all this. It's a stockfish advantage for white as well. So bishop to d7, forcing the action from this bishop on b5. Otherwise, we're about to take. Most players will play bishop takes d7 check back. If white plays bishop to d3, now I recommend we play c takes d4. And this is similar to what we talk about in the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. We want to damage this structure in the advanced variation. So when we play c takes d4 and white doesn't have a pawn on c3 ready to capture back, this damages white's pawn chain. Now there's no d4 e5 pawn chain, and white's not going to ever get that. So we take this right away, and after knight f3, we can simply develop knight c6, and if white castles, we can now pin the knight. Even though that bishop has spent 2 moves getting to g4, the white bishop has spent 2 moves getting to d3, and we have a very good version of our regular old Caro-Kann advance. So this is, I think, the best move order for black. Let's say white plays knight b to d2, we play e6. Now we're kind of transposing into a normalish position with the advantage for us of having the pawn already on d4 without white being able to play c takes d back. So now let's go look at what happens if white takes on d7. I think this is going to be by far the most common move. Here we can play queen takes d7. And the reason I like taking with the queen is because I want the knight on c6, the most natural square for the knight. And what we're going to have happen here is after c3, e6, we get a French defense structure. This is a French advance. See the 3 white pawns, see our black pawn structure, just like a French. But we don't have the bad bishop on c8. That's usually the problem piece for black in the French defense. We got rid of it. And white doesn't have their good bishop sitting on f1 or d3. So we traded white's good bishop for our bad bishop. And now long term, white's going to have the pawn weakness on d4. Eventually we're going to play c takes d. When that pawn takes back, white has the weakest pawn on the board. And if white takes back with a piece on d4, then the e5 pawn becomes the weakest pawn on the board. So keep that in mind. You have a long-term endgame advantage with this pawn structure, and you got rid of the bad bishop. If instead of c3, white plays knight f3, again, I recommend we take because there's no c takes d back. I just wanted to mention that. All right, so let's look at c3. Most common move. We get our French structure, knight f3, knight c6, castle, and now we can play c takes d. The reason we play c takes d4 now is because if we were to play knight e7, this is important to remember, white can try to get away with taking this pawn, d takes c5, and we can't take either pawn back immediately. So I think we should just avoid this line. It does give white a small advantage according to Stockfish, and we should play c takes d4 first here. And then when white takes back, now knight e7. We have no pawn on c5, so white can't take. Knight c3, knight f5. So this is also what we talk about in the Caro-Kann course quite a bit. Take a look at the weakest white pawn on the board and try to keep applying pressure. It's all about pressure. More pressure. We have the pawn on d4 double attacked by the knights. It's defended twice. So if we're able to bring a third attacker to the pawn or distract one of the defenders, long term, this is going to be a problem for white. So let's look at knight e2. I think that's going to be a common reply. Bishop to e7 by black. And let's say white develops their bishop. Here we can simply castle. And you can see long term, it's going to be about this pawn. We have a good bishop, opposite color of our pawns. Black has a bad bishop, same color as their pawns. Rook c1, we can play bishop to d8. This is a cool maneuver. The bishop is coming out to b6, adding a third attacker to the pawn on d4. So at some point here, white's going to play a move like g4, trying to kick this knight and fix the problems with the d4 pawn. If we don't have this idea of knight h4, we can always drop the knight back to e7, reroute it to g6. But in this case, we can play knight h4, and if knight takes, bishop takes, these trades help us. We had a little bit of congestion with the knights if we had to retreat, and white still has the long-term weakness on d4 that we can play against, and potentially an open king if our queen stays on the board. Another thing to think about when g4 is played, we do have this f6 break that can try to open up our rook and help attack the white king. So always keep that in mind. All right, so bishop d8. Let's look at queen to d2 by white. Here we can go bishop to b6, triple attack on the d pawn now. And if white plays a move like king h1, trying to get ready for g4, and bring a rook to the open file, contest that c1 rook. And after g4, in this case, we bring knight back to e7. There's no knight to h4. It's not protected anymore. And if white plays, let's say, b4 over on the queen side, now we can utilize this idea, f6, chip away at these center pawns. So I know we didn't go through a lot of lines here, but I want to thank Christopher for submitting this question. And keep these ideas in mind, because even though you don't have to have all of these moves memorized, you can use the same ideas when you face move 4, bishop to b5 check. All right, so I'm going to leave you guys with another related video that you can check out on the Caro-Kann. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not a subscriber, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.